Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Escarpment Labs webinar series. Escarpment Labs is a yeast producer based in Guelph, Canada. We work with breweries all over the world to solve fermentation problems and create new flavor opportunities. I'm Richard Priest, co-founder of Escarpment Labs, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. If you're joining us live, please tell us who you are and what you've been brewing lately. I hear a lot of people are brewing these days, at least at home, maybe not at work. The Crowdcast platform is an excellent way to get conversations started, so feel free to use that sidebar on the right-hand side. Today our topic is Yeast Basics Part 3, Harnessing Yeast Flavor. I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Today we have Nate Ferguson, co-founder of Escarpment Laboratories and professor at the Niagara College Brewing Program. For those that are joining us live, feel free to start a discussion on the Crowdcast, ask questions and upvote questions. I'll do my best to monitor that discussion and follow up with our speaker if needed. For those that are tuning in after the live cast, and please note that you can tune in after the live cast, thanks for checking out what we have to offer. Our recorded version of this webinar will be available. It's available short-term through Crowdcast. We're also going to be uploading all of these to our YouTube channel as well. And then if there are any questions that we don't get to in this webcast, the next one that we're hosting is a Q&A session that we have planned for the end of the Yeast Basics series, and we're going to do a deep dive into some of the common themes that are coming up in those questions. So without further ado, I want to give Nate the floor to tell us about Yeast Basics Part 3, Harnessing Yeast Flavor.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. Give us about 2 seconds. We'll get ourselves all situated. Wonderful. Okay, so as Richard said, today is all about yeast basics. Kind of the third portion of this. Now, as we've been moving through the 3 different stages of the Yeast Basics program, you may notice that we start off with the very basic principles that are true about, I'd say, 99% of the time. Everything we covered last time, this past Thursday, is probably about 97% accuracy. As we get further and further in these topics, well, there's going to be more and more exceptions to this. You'll find me a few times today pinpointing where some of these exceptions are. These are areas where we will be talking about these in later webinars, or these might be things that are strain dependent or kind of class of yeast cells dependent, or we don't understand why they are. Just these odd strains do this weird thing. We are still talking about the generalities, but we are starting to get kind of further out into the fringes, so variance is going to start increasing. There we are. Now, today we've also had a slight modification what we were originally going to talk about. So today was controlling flavor production. So we're going to talk about fermentation temperature, pitch rate, fermentation geometry, and handling. And we were going to talk about yeast cropping and pitching. However, that topic is far too large, and we did not want to do it, skim over it quickly and not do it justice. So we're going to talk about that one at a later point. Now, a disclaimer, as always, the goal here is to cover information that's going to make you a better brewer, not to make you a brewing scientist. We're going over the basics to teach you why these things work. I'm also not just going to throw numbers at you and say, learn it. We're going to talk and understand what those numbers actually represent and how we can actually use the principles behind those things to make you a better brewer. As Richard mentioned beforehand, if you have any questions or comments, please put it in the chat. Please ask questions. We already have a bunch coming in, which we will be answering at the end. So today we'll be delving into how we can manipulate the environment of the cells in order for them to produce a certain thing that we want. Now, as we mentioned in prior webinars, yeast cells are doing these things that for their own well-being, and we simply, manipulate them. We twist them and turn them into the ways that we want. The good point. So the thing we've already shown you is what all the levers are. We want to do this to make this flavor, this to make this flavor. Today we're going to show you how we can bring all these things together and actually use them to finalize the final beer. Now, I thought it was kind of neat for us to start off at something, because now the concept today is talk about how we can change yeast environments in order to, get it to do something we want. Now, an interesting conversation is to see how yeast has actually altered our environment, which is kind of neat. Oh, and yes, just to mention again, we will be covering yeast cropping and management. It's going to be a much larger topic than we originally thought. It's going to be a whole separate thing. Look for Yeast Basics Part 5 or some sort of other version of that in the near future. So we're going to look at this kind of common theme of how humans and yeast can work together. We can very easily manipulate the yeast cells environment. However, yeast cells have had a big impact on us. Arguably, they've had a larger impact on us than any other organism out there. There's a lot of kind of gray area and some historical assumptions for this, but we're going to get into it. So we're at home. For those who aren't aware, humans are thought to have originated in what's an area called the Indus River Valley, which is located in modern-day kind of India, Pakistan area. And this is a high floodplain. There's lots of easy crops to grow in this area. It's not hard for agriculture to kind of take form. And this society is one of the first kind of societies that's ever established. And one of the interesting things is that when you look at all the literature and all the kind of ruins and writings from this time period, which they did have some very basic writings, a large portion of it is based on how they can keep track of certain livestock or certain amounts of materials. More importantly, things required to make alcohol. It's kind of neat. Now, there is a theory as to this, as to how humans actually got towards civilization. What environment was required in order for humans to go from being nomadic hunter-gatherers into actually farming. And it goes something like this, that you had these clay pots, which we know they had, and these primitive humans essentially found barley or grapes or oats or some sort of other something that's fermentable. They put it in the pot and then they forgot about it. It rained, so the whole thing got wet. They find the pot a few days later and it's fermenting because there's wild yeast everywhere. People tried it, loved it, and they wanted to make more of it. And that's one of the arguments as to how humans went from kind of realizing that hunter-gathering probably wasn't the best way and finding a way that they could actually, maybe sustain themselves. And then we get farming and we get plows and all those things. There's a lot of assumption, there's a lot of leaks, but it is kind of an interesting story. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence behind it. If you want to look at another place to find some more of these different kind of cool things, there is a documentary about this. Now, again, there's a lot of kind of assumptions on this, but the core concepts do kind of hold up. It's really neat. My favorite bit's about Egypt, but go take a watch. Now, with that being said, we're going to break today into 4 groups, 3 main chunks, and then one kind of last bit tying it all together. We'll look at fermentation temperature, how it impacts yeast cells fermentation and flavor, pitching rate, how it impacts yeast cells flavor, and then finally fermentation geometry, something that people do not give enough credit to and has a really big impact. We'll be building on all the things we talked about last week, so you will see me often refer to things we talked about previously. So we're talking about fermentation temperature. Now, before we go further into this, I want us to all take a look at this graph. And this is one of the, I use this graph a lot when it comes to talking about fermentation, because this shows some very interesting things. So we'll be walking along the time scale as kind of briefly before we start jumping into temperature. So what we have specific gravity. This is 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. We start off around 1060 or about 15 degrees Plato. What we then start seeing how specific gravity, esters, higher alcohol, fusel alcohols, fan and diacetyl are all varied. So as the fermentation progresses, we have very little of all flavor initiates, we have very little flavor compounds across the board because nothing's really happened yet. But as we start fermenting, we start seeing some certain compounds increase. Now, some of the first things to really increase are fusel alcohols and diacetyl, which we see right up here. The fusel alcohols, these little triangles, and diacetyl has these little squares. And this is quite interesting because as the fermentation goes on, we keep on seeing this concentration increase. Now, we talked last week about how these things can actually originate. Fan plays a huge impact for higher alcohol. So if we were to give these cells the proper level of fan, we'd see this peak be decreased. It wouldn't go as high. Same thing goes for diacetyl. Diacetyl is mainly associated with the production of the amino acid valine. So if we just give them valine, we give them proper nutrition, we can actually knock down this curve. Every single line on this graph is manipulatable. None of these things are permanent except for specific gravity. But we'll keep on going on. Esters lag behind fusel alcohols and diacetyl, which makes sense because as we covered last week, esters are the byproduct, are a further downstream reaction of fusel alcohols. The fusel alcohols have to be present in order for the esters to actually produce. Now, once we get near about halfway to 2/3 of the way through fermentation, which you're going to hear me mention a lot, so we're just going to see this graph a handful of times today. Once we get through, we start seeing something interesting happen where the diacetyl starts plummeting. We saw this last week where diacetyl started to be reuptaken by the yeast cells at the end of ferment. That's what we're seeing right here. Diacetyl is broken down, reuptaken by the yeast cell, eventually goes to near zero as the fermentation nears completion. And there's one thing I really want to point out here. You notice that the specific gravity stabilizes out around the 110th hour or so, but diacetyl keeps on going down. Just because your fermentation has finished, just because the gravity is stable, does not mean the yeast cell isn't doing anything. It doesn't mean the yeast cell's not still fermenting or doesn't still have metabolism occurring. It's still doing stuff. You also see a similar impact with esters, where you still see them fluctuate a little bit. Higher alcohols remain fairly stable across the entire way. But yeast cells are still doing stuff. Just because they're done doesn't mean, just because the gravity is done doesn't mean they're not done fermenting. Now we're going to refer this chart a bunch today, so don't, you'll have other chances to look at it. So fermentation temperature is something that many brewers often find themselves confused about. And I see this with my students all the time, where they know that certain beer styles are fermented at different temperatures, but they don't understand why. And the simple answer to this is very simple, and we're going to dive into this a bit, is it's due to flavor. Temperature does impact flavor. There's no way around it. It is going to impact the flavor of your beer in quite radical ways. Now, as you mentioned last week, flavor compounds typically serve one of two purposes. They're either there to remove something toxic, or they're a byproduct of some sort of other essential reaction. Things like fusel alcohols and diacetyl are a good example of that. Fusel alcohols is a bit of both, actually. Now, based on nutrient, state of the cell, health, we can kind of prioritize one or the other based on what we provide it. However, temperature is one of the few things that's going to impact everything. It's going to impact both. It's going to impact the production of both, the reuptake of both. It's going to have its hands in every single variable that could occur for the yeast cell. Now, there's a few things for us to keep in mind in regards to the physiology or the state of the yeast cell. Now, much like molecules, yeast cells operate faster at higher temperatures. Now, humans don't do this. We can't do this. Humans do have a huge amounts of systems to regulate our body temperature. This is the reason why we sweat when it's hot. It's to release heat so our body maintains a temperature. It's the reason we shiver when it's cold. It's so our body maintains a temperature. Yeast cells being single cellular, they don't have the ability to alter their environment or to alter their state to maintain a certain temperature. They have to go with the flow. They have to live in that environment. So yeast cells are very used to and very adept at altering the temperature at which they survive. So temperature has a much larger impact on them, than it would on us. So this is why it's important. Now, just in case anyone wanted to kind of refresh for this, because I've seen people be a little confused by this, what we have here is a sample of cold air versus hot air. Now, cold air, when you look at the molecules are going to move much slower. They're not going to be as quick. They're not going to be as impactful. They're going to be slower. They're not going to move around as rapidly or fanatically. Hot air, on the other hand, is going to move much faster. It's going to have much more impact. It's going to have much more alteration to its environment. It's going to do much more. Going to do much more. And this is because those molecules have more energy. They're able to fly around all over the place, where cold molecules are much slower. Same thing goes for yeast cells. A cold yeast cell is going to move and it's going to ferment at a slower pace. It's going to ferment sugar slower. A hot yeast cell or a warm yeast cell is going to ferment things much faster. It's going to be moving around. It's going to be producing more CO2. It's going to be doing everything at a faster rate. Just like molecules, so yeast cells do the same thing. Now, in regards to metabolism, we see many things change when it comes to temperature. The biggest impact, is that each metabolic pathway becomes how I conceptualize it to be overloaded. What I mean by that, and we'll see in the next slide, is that we see the unintended side products start increasing quite radically. Now, the result of this is that more byproducts of essential reactions occur. We see that second pathway, the non-toxic pathway, start increasing quite radically. So let's walk through what that means. Oh, before we get into that, another way to think of this from regards to metabolism. Metabolism is kind of like water flowing through a garden hose. You see on the right-hand side, we have a low pressure or a low volume of water going through a hose. And it's pointed, it's directional, it's easy to control where that's going. It is smooth, it's laminar flow, if anyone has a little bit of a fluid dynamics background a bit. It's much easier to point that in a certain place or to go one intended direction. Now, if we start putting large amounts of volume through the same hose, or we say put your finger on the end and it starts, we increase the pressure, it no longer goes from being laminar, it goes to turbulent, and it starts spraying. You're pointed one direction, but it's spraying in a radius. It's spraying, not just at one point, in a zone. The same kind of thing happens when we look at metabolism. When we ferment slower, we're going to see almost all the sugar, all the things that it consumes, go towards pretty much ethanol and a few other places. Everything becomes much more efficient. If we're trying to fill the bucket or fill the watering can, it all goes in. When we heat things up, we start going through a lot more volume. It's kind of like trying to fill a watering can with a fire hose. You're going to get there, but it's going to be a lot of things get wet on the sides. And that's what we're going to look at when it comes to metabolism. So we saw this graph or this chart last week, but we've added some additions to it. So this is what happens when a yeast cell goes through a hotter temperature, when it's fermenting at hotter temps. So I want to run through what this means. So the sugar is here. There's so much sugar going through here that ideally, and from the yeast cell's health standpoint, we want the sugars to go to pyruvate, acetaldehyde, and ethanol. We want maximum amount of energy we can possibly get from this. However, because we have so much going through this pathway, we're going to see other things light up. We're going to see kind of some spray into other metabolic pathways. Same thing goes for amino acids. We're going to have amino acids come in at such a fast rate that they're not all going to go towards cell growth. We're going to see a lot more vicinal diketones produced, a lot more diacetyl being produced. We're going to see a lot more fusel alcohols or higher alcohols be produced because we have so much metabolism going through here, so much more consumption going through here. And depending on our oxygen content, we're going to see more esters. Now, this is heavily dependent on the oxygen content. And as a net, we actually typically see a small decrease in ethanol. This is because instead of the sugars going towards just ethanol, they're going to all of these different types of substances, all these different flavor compounds that we may or may not want. Now, flavor-wise, we see two real compounds increase quite radically, and that is diacetyl and fusel alcohols, neither of which are good. However, if we ferment open or we add oxygen, we have high amounts of dissolved oxygen inside that initial ferment. We're going to see the diacetyl be reuptaken quite easily, and we're going to see the fusel alcohols get turned into esters. This makes lots of sense. When people start talking about increasing fermentation temperature, causing increasing ester profile, you have about 3/4 of the story. You also need the oxygen component. If you just have the increase in temp, you don't always have that esterification process occurring. You need to have both. However, if we do increase temperatures, we are going to see more fusels, which gives us more potential for esters. We just have to make sure we have that oxygen component. Now, there's a lot of gray area surrounding that, and certain strains have some oddities to it. But as a generality, 95% of the time, that's pretty correct. Now, if we look at some common beers that are produced, we can actually see this in action. Trappist beers can go up to about 24 degrees Celsius quite easily, and these are typically either open fermented or highly aerated when they knock them out. Weizens are usually 22+ degrees Celsius, open fermented or lots of oxygen. Wits and Saisons, 23+, open fermented or lots of oxygen. It's a common theme here. I can't think of a single beer style where that is fermented hot that also is not known to produce is not also given large amounts of oxygen. You need those two together. You need them. Otherwise, you're going to get a large amount of fusels and a lot of flavors that you don't actually want. Now, the next question logically would be, why don't all these hot fermented beers contain diacetyl? Now, and the simple answer here is that they actually at one point did contain large amounts of diacetyl. But as we talked about last week, almost all of that stuff has been broken down and reuptaken. We saw this last week when we started looking at alpha-acetolactate, that flavorless, odorless, tasteless component that with heat and oxygen breaks down into diacetyl, which can then be reuptaken. Now remember, this alpha-acetolactate is produced for valine. So when we have hotter temps and the yeast cells just running through tons of metabolism through here, we're going to see a lot more leakage. If it's cold, we won't see nearly as much. However, if we look at the conditions required for alpha-acetolactate to break down into diacetyl, we have higher temperatures and oxygen. The two things we always see when it comes to open fermented warm beers. Always see those two. So yes, these beers did contain a large amount of diacetyl. However, almost all of that has been broken down and then reabsorbed by the healthy yeast currently going through that ferment. They have both. The large amounts of diacetyl produced, large amounts of diacetyl reuptaken. Works quite well. So a few of you might be thinking, after all of this, if this works very well, why don't we ferment all our beers warm? Why is it that the standard fermentation regime is kind of cold? There's a few reasons for this. One of the first ones is that a large amount of brewing knowledge, so to speak, comes from the Germans, and the Germans aren't usually looking for very expressive yeast cells. They're usually looking for clean when it comes to their yeast, often using lagers, which these rules don't apply to nearly as much. Basic principles do, however, not to the same degree as ale yeasts. And more flavor compounds aren't always good. What you actually start seeing when you start getting too high of an ester concentration, can come off, the esters can come off almost like nail polish remover. It can be very, acetone-like. Not good by any means. So control here really is key. Too much isn't always better. You want some level of balance. Now, if you do want a cleaner beer, which many times you do, cold is the way to go. That's how you have to go with these beers. So let's take a look at that same chart we saw beforehand, but when we do a cold ferment. Now, much like before when you saw, the slower fermentation rate, we want the yeast cell wants sugars to go to pyruvate, which go to acetaldehyde to go to ethanol, which because we have less of these other compounds, we actually see a slight increase in ethanol, very small, but still noteworthy. Because the amino acid composition or consumption, is slower, we're going to see much more efficient. We're not going to see alpha-acetylactate being pushed to the outside of the cell. Anything that is produced will be consumed and used right away. It won't leak out. Same thing goes for any sort of nitrogen sources that are present within the cell. They'll get efficiently used, so the yeast cell won't have to go through as much of the anabolic or catabolic pathway. The result here is less diacetyl or VDKs, less fusel alcohols, and usually less esters, mainly because there's an oxygen component here. It heavily depends on the last variable, but usually it is less. So choosing the right temperature when it comes to any fermentation is crucial. There's no way around it. But unfortunately, usually for most breweries, it's a lot of trial and error. Certain strains are known to work well at certain temperatures, and I'm sure if you ask your local yeast lab, we can help you out with it. We all know kind of how these different yeast cells perform and what makes them good and what makes them bad. There's also a handful of things that professional and home brewers alike can do that are also going to stress their yeast cells out, which might require you to add more yeast cells to that batch, some of which we'll be talking about later in this presentation. So just to kind of give a little synopsis, I said we were just going to see this chart again. So what does this chart look like when we have a higher fermentation temp? Well, it's quite simple. Higher fermentation temps are going to cause an increase in fusels, an increase in diacetyl, an increase in esters. So what we see here is that all three of those would increase. We're going to see that the fusel alcohols get higher and stay higher. We're going to see the diacetyl get higher and then plummet faster, which is typically what we see happen. Typically, is more of a peak opposed to a sharp peak opposed to a less sharp peak. And the esters typically get higher. And overall, we'll also see a decrease in fermentation time. So we won't see, where this fermentation took about 100 hours, we probably see it take, 80, 60, depends on the strain. If it's a Kvike, 60 wouldn't be out of the question. And conversely, we're going to look at colder temperatures. We're going to see the opposite happen here. We'll see less VDKs, less diacetyl, so that curve's going to be almost like a little lower in the curve, so to speak. We're going to see less higher alcohols or fusel alcohols. We'll see much less esters. But we're also going to see an elongation in fermentation time. So where here it takes 100 hours, it may take 120, 130, 150 hours to the next step. Fermentation temperature has a big impact on every single portion of it. It's not single variable like we saw last week when it came to nutrient composition. This has a big impact across the board. So as a generality, in general, the colder you ferment, the cleaner your beer is going to be. This is due to the cells being able to do things slower and more completely. So there's less errors or less kind of unintended pathways being activated. Producing off flavors is what yeast cells do not want to do. They don't like doing that. So it's less efficient. So the colder they are, the less we're going to see those things occur. Remember, to hark back from last week, yeast cells don't like fusels. It's a lesser of two evils for them to do so. They like kind of being cleaner, so to speak. And a colder, slower ferment, especially at the beginning, will always result in cleaner beers. Always, across the board, regardless of strain. And with that, we're going to move on to section 2, which is pitching rate. So you often hear brewers discuss pitching rate strictly as numbers, and I often find brewers get kind of lost or confused with this because they don't actually understand what the numbers mean. They don't get it, and that's not to their fault. This often isn't talked about. So example, a pitch rate could be 1.2 million cells per mil per degree Plato. How did we actually get to this number? This is an effective way to kind of easily talk about it, especially when you're in a brewery trying to figure out, what is the pitch rate for this beer versus this beer. But we don't often understand why there are differences between two different beers in the same facility. So we're going to talk about how these numbers are actually derived. So we're not going to be using numbers to talk about this till the end of the section. We're going to be focusing really why these things are here and how they're derived. Now, once you understand how they're derived, you can make a much better decision about what you should do. Much better, quite easily. Now, much like humans, all yeast are not able to handle the same stress. I know some people who can handle massive workloads and some people who just, they can't. We see a similar thing for yeast. Now, lager yeasts really can't handle a huge amount of stress per cell. There's reasons for this, which we'll be talking about in a later webinar, but they're really a low stress capacity yeast cell. Now, there's always exceptions to this, and some lager yeasts are phenomenal, but for the most part, a lot of them are not so great. Clean ale yeast, American ale yeast, or English ale yeast, I would classify this as a medium workload strain. They can handle a moderate amount of stress, but not a huge amount. Trappist ale yeast can handle a good amount. They're kind of medium high. Saison yeast are incredibly high workload strains. They can handle tons of stress. And Kvike, I wouldn't be surprised if they can handle an infinite workload, but that's a topic for another day. To give you kind of a human analogy to this, we kind of have lager yeast would kind of be like your toddler or your young child. They can't handle a huge amount of stress. And when they break down, you are very aware. They make a mess. They do things you don't want them to. They kind of fall apart. They're doing things you don't understand why they're doing this thing, but it's causing a huge problem. Unfortunately accurate for lager yeast. Now, a saison yeast would be more so like a Navy SEAL. They're really hard to harm. They're durable. They can handle tons and tons of stress. They keep on going. You can kill them, but they're very difficult to do so. And Kvike might be like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. I'm not quite sure. I just wanted a chance to put Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the presentation. Completely honest. Now, all the pitch rate comes down to these two principles when it comes to pitch rate. Each yeast cell is only able to complete a certain workload under certain conditions. Each yeast cell can only handle a certain unit of work. That's it. And much like each human is only able to handle so much work. Once we start pushing past that, that's when we start having problems, which we're going to get into. And working past this standard will start causing errors. For humans, we start seeing mistakes. We start seeing things being missed. We start seeing problems occur. For yeast cells, we start seeing, more fermentation required by each cell. Each one's having to do more work, more stress, more off flavors, more cell death, more damage, all these things that are not good. So on top of this, just kind of be consistent with our question we've had in the past, we have to kind of ask why this is. Why is there this variance amongst yeast cells? Now, unfortunately, this topic is well beyond the scope, but I didn't want to seem like I was kind of, trying to shy away from the topic. If you want to learn more about this, please ask us in the comments. If enough people, we might do another webinar on this. But this is a much larger topic than what we really have time for today. I just wanted to make sure we weren't, trying to skirt a topic here. It's just a very large, complicated topic. But it's very interesting. Now, how do these cells account, or how can we account for this stress? Now, this is where we can use pitch rate to actually help manipulate this. In a nutshell, it's quite simple. If less work can be done by each individual, we just need more of them. We can get into this. So say we need to complete 100 units of work, and that work can be anything. We're just using it as an example. It could be fermentation, it could be woodworking, it could be bricklaying, it doesn't matter. So we're going to give you a handful of different strains that are out there. So let's go lager yeast. We'll say it can handle 2 units of work per cell. Clean ale yeast 4, Trappist 6, Saison 8, and we'll go crazy with Kvike and go 20. How many cells do we need to actually get the work done? It's simple. We just divide 100 by how much work each cell can do, and we figure this out. And this is actually a really good kind of thought process when it comes to yeast cell pitch rate. Lager yeast, we typically need a lot more of them in a fermentation because each one is not able to handle as much fermentation as, say, something else. So we need more of them. And we see that here, 50 cells per 100 workload. That's fine. Clean ale yeast, they can handle twice the workload per cell. We need half of them, which is typically what we see. Trappist ale strains, they're more fit than ale yeast, than clean ale yeast. We can use less of them. That's great. We can use about 17 or so for this 100 units of work. Saison yeast are even more durable and more fit than Trappist yeast cells, and Kvike is even more durable. What we're really looking at here is how much work, how much stress can each one of these cells handle, and how do we level the amount of work we're giving them with how fit each cell is. We need those two to meet. If we go too far in one direction, we start having problems. That's where we're going to start going to the next area. So now that we understand how much stress each cell can handle as a rough picture, we now have to look at how much stress we're actually loading onto the cells. How much are we actually applying on these yeast cells to actually ask them to perform? So the way in which you see pitch rate typically described is it's X million of cells times mils of wort times a degree Plato. So this could be, say, 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, something that's very common for Cali or an English ale yeast or something like that. Now, the mils of wort you could think of it almost as the volume of work. How many bricks do I have to lay? And then the difficulty of work would be how heavy each one of those bricks is. Degrees Plato is how hard the work to do is. Mils of that work is how much work volume there actually is to do. When we multiply these two together, we figure out how difficulty or how much work actually has to get done. We then factor in the first part, the X million cells, which is how fit is a cell to actually, how much work can each cell actually perform? And then we can get a really good idea as to how many cells we need to put inside this beer. You know, if I have Cali, which is about 1 million cells, that's great. If it's a lager yeast, I need more of those things because they can't handle as much cells. So we'll go 2 million cells. If it's Saison, 0.3, 0.4, even 0.5. We need less of them than Cali because it's more durable. It can handle more. We don't need as many of them. And if we, as we'll see soon, if I actually add too much of them, we can actually start seeing negative problems occur. Oh, let's kind of push this a little bit further. So if we take our Trappist ale yeast here we saw before, this one that's able to handle about 6 units of work per cell, what happens if we push it past? What happens if we do make an error in this and we do actually stress it out? It's quite simple. If we underpitch, we're going to yeast, say we cause the yeast cell to consume 10 units of work, where it's only supposed to handle 6. Simply put, this isn't going to be good for it. It's going to stress out. Much like if, say, one person gets sick at work and you are now stuck doing their job for a few days, it's going to stress you out. You're going to be a little burnt out by the end of it. You're going to be fine. You can push through it. You can make it do. But at the end of it, you're going to be a little worse for wear. So same thing happens for yeast cells. We're not all that simple. And we talked about this beforehand. We saw this in the first lecture I gave in the series where yeast cells consuming a lot of sugar or high SG would be equivalent to a human with a large workload. You know, both of them are going to have poor performance and we're not going to work so great. Same thing for yeast cells. We're going to see more off flavors, more all the things we don't want to see in that at first fermentation. More importantly, after this, what happens after? So these cells are going to be a little bit stressed. They're going to be a little worn down, a little damaged. They're not going to be perfect. They've probably lost some of their capacity to function. Where before they were operating more like a Trappist ale yeast, so 6 units of work per cell. They're probably now at like 5. They're probably less. They've been damaged. They've been hurt. They're slightly wounded. They're not in their perfect form. They are less fit to ferment. They cannot perform as much work. Just like a human, you need some time off. You need to rest a little bit. You can't keep on pushing yourself. This is where things can start snowballing. Because if you now treat these cells that have lower capacity like they were still your 6, your 6 goes to 5, your 5 goes to 4, your 4 goes to very quickly to almost near 0, and everything falls apart. It's not good. It's not good at all. As a summary for this, underpitching typically causes increases in fusel alcohols, a decrease in ester concentration even when O2 is present. The yeast cell just can't physically cause esterification to occur when you underpitch, especially to an extreme. Diacetyl increases because the yeast cells are tired. They're stressed out. They don't have that energy required to reuptake the diacetyl. And on top of this, we also see acetaldehyde concentrations spike. As we talked about last week, NADH, that energy source, is required for the yeast cells to break down acetaldehyde into ethanol. If they're stressed out and tired, it's gone. There just isn't the required NADH to cause that reaction to occur. It's gone towards other things to repair the cell and maintain the cell's health. You're going to get acetaldehyde problems. Now, this is all strain dependent. Some strains are going to go more one way or less the other way and things like that. But as a generality, this is pretty true. My general feelings towards this is I can't think of a reason why you'd ever underpitch. Underpitching typically causes a lot of problems inside of beer, a lot of negative flavors inside of beer, which, as we'll see soon, it's really the lesser of two. It's really the larger of two evils. So we talked about underpitching. Now let's talk about overpitching, because it is a thing. So what happens if we overpitch? So overpitching is kind of akin to fasting. Now we have, say, 100 units of work to occur, and each cell is able to handle 6. We're going with a Trappist ale strain. If each strain is only able to go through 4 and it's work, that's fine. We've all had days where there's so many people, working that, the amount of work you normally have to do is a lot less. It makes your day easier. It's not so nice when it's food. If I have, say, enough food at a table for 6 people and 10 show up, everyone's walking away a little hungry. It's really not good. And this is where we start seeing problems start occurring when we start talking about overpitching, or really underfeeding is probably a better way to look at it. So the human equivalent to this, to a yeast cell being overpitched, would be a human fasting. Now, for both of these, they're going to get hungry. And I do mean that literally. The yeast cell will be wanting nutrients, needs nutrition for itself. Now, this acutely, one time, they can handle this, no problem. Much like a human, you can miss a meal. You're going to be a little cranky, but you're going to be fine. Chronically, though, you're going to start losing function quite rapidly. Same thing goes for the yeast cell. If we are constantly overpitching, we're going to start seeing problems with the cell. So you may often now find yourself in a choice. Do I underpitch or do I overpitch? In my opinion, you should always choose overpitching. And the reason for this is as such. Underpitching often produces bad beer. Now, from a homebrewing standpoint and from a pro brewing standpoint, no one wants to drink bad beer. No one wants to drink, bad tasting product. Life is too short to drink bad beer. And from a commercial standpoint, it's a lot more difficult to sell bad tasting beer, and it's a lot more damaging to your brand just to sell bad tasting beer. It's boring to drink boring beer, which is typically what happens when we overpitch. It's a lot easier to sell boring beer. It's a lot less damaging to your reputation to sell boring beer. I'd always recommend overpitching if you have to choose between the two. Do I add one brink or do I add 2 brinks? Add 2. It's a better option. And with that, we'll go on to our last kind of new topic, which is fermentation geometry. This is something that I often find people gloss over massively, and it really doesn't get no one ever gives it the justice it requires, but it does have a huge impact on fermentation profiles. So when we look at fermentation geometry, what we mean by this is the structure in which fermentation occurs in. The vessel, whether it be a carboy or a conical fermenter or a massive horizontal aging tank or what may have you. We're going to see 2 main causes of stress occur on this. And these are hydrostatic pressure, which is the physical weight of the liquid on the yeast, or the pressure of the liquid on the yeast. And the secondly being CO2 concentration, so the dissolved CO2 content. Both of these have a big impact when it comes to fermentation. So hydrostatic pressure, just to go through too, is essentially just the weight of the tank of the liquid on top of these yeast cells. Now, you probably haven't really thought about this, but if we look at a fermenter, there's going to be more pressure at the bottom than there is at the top. And if we start going in tanks that say 1 story, 2 story, 3 stories tall, this can be quite significant. We actually start seeing the yeast cells at the bottom experience different stresses than the yeast cells on the top. Now, it's a known phenomenon here, but hydrostatic pressure operates the same way of chilling your fermenter. Hydrostatic pressure slows the rate of fermentation down. Where, say, if we're fermenting, say, 22 degrees Celsius, but we put pressure on that, we can almost make that fermentation operate like it's fermenting at 18 Celsius. It's going to slow the rate of respiration down. It's going to slow the rate of fermentation down. And as we saw beforehand, whenever we slow the rate of fermentation down, we're going to produce a cleaner product. Less diacetyl, less fusel alcohols, less esters, less acetaldehyde, less positive and negative flavor compounds. Now, for kind of a physical representation of how hydrostatic pressure works, what we have here is just a water column. And we have 3 different holes that are made on the side. The top has the weakest jet. You can see it goes the closest, so the smallest distance away, while the jet at the bottom, where it has the most amount of liquid pushing down on it, has the highest jet, the most aggressive jet coming off of it. That's the hydrostatic pressure pushing things down. It's all that pressure can go on the yeast cells fermenting at the bottom. We'll talk more about this when we start looking at yeast cropping and things like that when we do the last lecture, or the yeast cropping and handling webinar. That's a whole extra hour on its own. Now, CO2 concentration effectively has the same exact effect as cooling as well. Both hydrostatic pressure and CO2 both slow the rate of fermentation. Now, there are a few odd things you may not be thinking of that actually cause an increase in CO2 to build up inside of your tanks. One of the things that you see a lot of breweries not think about is actually the off-gas arm. So if I'm, say, working on a 40 hectoliter fermentation vessel, but I only have 1.5 inch TC pipe coming off of that tank, that's a small volume. I've seen fermenters that are, say, 200 hex, 300 hex that are still using 1.5 inch TC blow-off arms. There's a lot more CO2 coming out of a fermentation that's 200 hex versus 40 hex versus 1. The size of that blow-off arm is going to have a big impact on it. So just making sure how you can actually get the gas away. Now, what we see on the opposite side of this with open fermentation is that open fermentation, we see almost all the CO2 flash off right away. Almost dissolved CO2 content is effectively 0 because there's a massive surface area for all that CO2 to flash off in. The other thing we start seeing increased CO2 content is actually a colder fermentation. For anyone who's carbonated beer, force carbed it before, you know that in order to get the CO2 inside solution, you need that beer to be cold. Now, if I have two different ferments, one is fermenting at 12, the other one is fermenting at 18. The 12 degrees C beer is going to have a much higher CO2 content than the 18 degrees Celsius ferment. The colder we ferment, the more CO2 we're going to build up. This is part of the reason why lagers tend to be cleaner. They actually have more CO2 built up on them, therefore the fermentation is naturally going to be slower. Now, if you want to really take advantage of this, we mentioned this a little bit in the Q&A before, and I guarantee we'll talk more about this when we talk about lagers, is spunding. So spunding is a way for us to start adding pressure onto the tank during fermentation. This is what we see on the right-hand side is the homebrew version, the left-hand side is the commercial version that would attach to a proper fermentation vessel or a conical vessel. This allows us to control how much pressure is within the tank itself. So how much is within the headspace of the vessel. If we want to slow that fermentation down more, increase the pressure. Makes your life pretty easy. Now, there are some potential negatives when it comes to spunding, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it because I'm sure we're going to get a lot of people asking questions about this. Spunding will also cause other gases to become more soluble. Now, one of the big ones you have to worry about here or try to preserve is sulfur. Now, sulfur can be very nice in some lagers, but if you're trying to make a Hefeweizen or you're trying to make a NEPA or something like that, it's not probably something you want. Sulfur can be flashed off by increasing the fermentation temperature and removing that CO2. So if you do want a slower, cleaner ferment, and then you want to flash off the CO2, this will work. I probably wouldn't recommend this, but I do know of one brewery that does something similar to this, and their beers are great. So there's an option out there. But we'll talk more about this when we look at when we start looking at lagers. So with that, we're just going to take a quick little walk, a little comparison side by side of a few different fermenters and actually see how their setup is going to impact the flavors that they are producing. So we'll start off with the classic on the left-hand side, just your standard glass carbo with a little airlock on it. So a few things to keep in mind here. That airlock is actually going to give a little bit of back pressure. It's going to push some of that pressure back down. So we're going to see a little bit more dissolved CO2 occur inside this vessel. Now the fermenter on the right, it probably has the same style of airlock occurring. Now this one on the right is about a 100 liter or 1 hec fermenter. This one here is about 20 liters. We're going to see a lot more CO2 trying to go through that same airlock, which means we're going to see a lot more pressure start building up on the inside of it. We're going to have a higher dissolved CO2 content in this guy on the right than we would on the left. Now, additionally, this is not a huge impact because we're talking, maybe 2 feet to 6 feet. But the unit on the right is going to have a higher hydrostatic pressure. So that liquid's going to be pressing much more force down on the yeast cells at the bottom of that vessel, which means we're also going to see a slower fermentation. Now, this is a very small scale version of this, so let's step it up a little bit. What we see here are 2 40 hectoliter fermenters. This one on the left is from De La Seine in Belgium, and it's a very stout, very round, very wide fermenter. The one on the right is a standard CCV, a standard, closed conical fermenter. The one on the left-hand side is meant for making a bit more expressive yeast cells, expressive beers. And it's doing so by having a more shallow vessel, which means that CO2 is not going to build up as much inside this vessel. The hydrostatic pressure, more importantly, is not going to be as high. So it's going to be able to, the yeast cell is going to be a bit more expressive because it's not going to be as slowed down by that pressure. The one on the right, having all that CO2 also having to come through a small little arm on the side, the liquid height, the hydrostatic pressure, and the built-up CO2 is going to both cause that fermentation to slow down and for us to get a cleaner product. Now, this is a good example here. Sometimes we want a cleaner product. Sometimes we don't want a cleaner product. Some breweries will design their fermentation vessels to emphasize a certain fermentation profile, and it works very, very well. And something that I feel like a lot of breweries kind of overlook because everyone just goes for the standard conical fermenter. You're missing something by not looking at these guys. Now let's go bigger. What we see here are about 100 hectoliter to 200 hectoliter vessels. These are going to push a lot more hydrostatic pressure down, and they're going to cause a lot more CO2 to build up inside that tank. We're pushing both out. Hydrostatic pressure goes up and dissolved CO2 goes up. Now, just to give you a quick kind of side story for something like this, I'm sure everyone who's here knows who Stone Brewing is, like Stone from California, Arrogant Bastard, things like that. The beer, Arrogant Bastard, not the owners. Leave that one up to you. If you look at any of the recipes they publish, they always say they ferment at 18 degrees Celsius. However, in practice, they actually ferment at 22 to 23 degrees Celsius. And the reason for this is that their tanks they're fermenting are very large. They're talking, hundreds of barrels for those facilities. And because the hydrostatic pressure is so great, they have to ferment at higher temperatures to offset the slowdown. And this is how you see a lot of breweries kind of modulate these two back and forth. If I have greater height, therefore my yeast cell fermentation is going to slow down. I'm going to get a clean fermentation profile that I may actually not be happy with. I might want the yeast cells to become more expressive. And one way to do that is by upping the temperature back up. You know, I can, if the fermentation kinetics of the vessel itself is actually slowing down my fermentation, I have to do something else to increase this fermentation, which would just be adding more degrees Celsius. You know, we can use this as a push-pull mechanic. We can increase hydrostatic pressure, or say spun the beer, then ferment hotter. We can use these as back and forth levers. Now, to go one step even higher than these, 100 to 200 hectoliters and make these things look tiny, are these massive fermenters. These are some of the ones that are being installed in Molson. Which is a very large, like kind of a Budweiser-sized brewery in Canada. Anyone who's in the U.S. and doesn't know who Molson is or is from outside of North America, these are massive fermenters, and these fermenters are going to naturally produce drier, cleaner beer. The reason for that is because the hydrostatic pressure and the dissolved CO2 content is going to be so high that those fermentations are just they're going to be slower. They're naturally going to occur. They can crank the temperature up on these things and ferment lagers at, say, 17, 18 degrees Celsius and not have to worry about it because the pressure is higher. One of the other things that we haven't mentioned so far, but we actually see when you get to tanks this large, is you see stratification of CO2 concentrations among the tank. So at the bottom, we'll see a very high CO2 content, and the top, we'll see a very, much lower CO2 content. So we see stratification of all sorts of things in these large vessels. These are not easy vessels to maintain. That's a very large separate talk. So with that talk about fermentation geometry, that really kind of finishes the three main talks we have to cover before we can start looking at how we bring these things all together. For the last section is going to be about. We're going to take back control. So say we're trying to make a best bidder. How can we actually, in English style, if anyone wasn't aware, how can we take all these different components and how can we use this to influence the decisions? So we're going to look at temperature, we're going to look at fermentation rate, we're going to look at pitch rate. So with these three pieces, or these three kind of pieces of information, we can, with the same yeast cell, with the same wort, we can really push this ferment in different ways. Say we wanted to make a very clean English style ale. Well, we could ferment coolly, 18 degrees Celsius. That's going to give us less flavors. We could go with a high pitch rate. That's going to give us low stress and low flavors. And we can go with closed fermentation, which is going to give us low esters. We can modulate that quite easily. If I want kind of a middle of the road, I want some esters, I want some cleanness, I want a kind of middle, I can ferment at 21 degrees Celsius, get kind of a moderate level of flavor compounds. Give it a moderate amount of O2 to kind of get some esters. I can do a moderate pitch rate, 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato. Going to give me, a moderate level, kind of a standard level of flavor compounds. And I can do a closed high O2 dose during cast out. That's going to be right down the middle. If I really want to push this, I really want to, get as much ester profile out of these yeast cells as possible, I can go hot. I can ferment that beer at 24 degrees Celsius. Now, I might get some undesirable flavors, but I'm going to really crank out the flavor profile from that yeast cell. Add lots of oxygen. That's going to give me a large amount, or open ferment even better. And I can add a low amount of yeast cells, really stress them out and really try to push more of that out. We can modulate this different ways and produce very different beers based on pitch rate, fermentation temperature, and fermentation kinetics or geometry. Now let's bring us to another style of beer. Let's say a Belgian Ale, a Trappist Ale. We can push and pull these things to go one way we want. Say if I want a high ester, low fusel Belgian Ale, how I would handle this? High fermentation temperature around 23 degrees Celsius, a moderate pitch rate around 0.75 mils per million cells per mil degree Plato, and an open fermentation or high O2 during ferment. The reasons for here, I want a lot more of those side pass. I want a lot more of that kind of splash of flavor profile to occur. I want this ferment to be less efficient than normal. I want flavors. Moderate pitch rate, which means I'm not going to stress any of the yeast cells out. The yeast cells are going to have to work. They're not going to be underfed. They're not going to be underutilized. They're going to be right where we want them. And I give them a large amount of oxygen, high amount of O2, open vessel, no CO2 development, no slowing down of fermentation. I'm probably going to ferment these in a shallow vessel like we saw with the de la Seine fermenter. I'm really going to try and push fermentation flavor profile. Now I can take that same yeast and that same everything and make a low ester, low fusel Belgian Ale. Quite simply. Lower fermentation temperature, 19 degrees Celsius, everything's going to be reduced. Fusels, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, esters, everything's going to be reduced. I'm going to use a higher pitch rate, which means that the stress is going to be more evenly distributed across more cells. Each one's going to have to go through less stress, even less errors, less flavors. And I can use a closed ferment with moderate levels of O2. I'm not going to really push esters one way. I'm going to develop a little bit of CO2 to slow that fermentation down a little bit, clean it up a little bit. I'll probably put this in maybe a story and a half tall CCV or closed conical fermenter. I'm going to change the way in which I handle this beer, even though it's the same exact wort, to get a very different fermentation flavor out of this product. And we can put all these these things together to really influence the way in which we decide to handle our beer. There's a few other things I recommend you guys do when it comes to handling your beer. And these are just kind of some good housekeeping things. These are things that will really help your yeast cells out. And I mentioned them in other talks already. The first one is overcooling, and the second one is a free rise at the end of ferment. We're going to spend some time with the free rise. So overcooling at the beginning of ferment is a nice thing for you guys to do to your cells. Now, as a general rule, and as I stated previously, yeast cells don't like cooling. Cooling slows them down. Cooling makes them do additional work. It stresses them out. What you want to do then is cool your wort 1 to 2 degrees Celsius below your fermentation temperature. So if I want to ferment at 20, knock out at 18 degrees Celsius. I want to ferment at 24, knock out at 22. Give them some temperature so that the first thing they experience as they're waking out of the dormancy, as they're going from that G0 phase we saw last week into the cell cycle, is a rise in temperature. Make their life easy. You never want the first thing the yeast cells to see is crashing. Stresses them right out, and you see a decrease in fermentation temperature. Sorry, in fermentation time. None of it's good. None of it's good. Now, the second thing, and we're going to spend a bit more time on this, is what's often described as a free rise. Now, the good part of this is it's a really easy way for us to get a lot more beer through a facility. It's wonderful, but it's not suitable for all beer styles. And this could be a whole talk on itself, but we're just going to give you guys kind of the Coles notes for it. The goal here is that halfway to 3/4 of the way through ferment, you want to turn all the cooling off. Or if you're home brewing, you want to take your fermenter, say, near your furnace, near somewhere where it's going to heat up. And the reason here is such: you want the first half of your fermentation to be slower. You want to reduce the amount of flavor compounds that produce. You want less fuses. You want less esters. You want less diacetyl. You want less acetaldehyde. But in the second half, you want to maximize reuptake. So by heating the fermentation up, we're going to see the rate at which diacetyl is reuptaken increase. Same thing goes for acetaldehyde. It's going to come down at a faster rate. Fusel alcohols have already been produced, so we're not going to see more produced. But because it's a higher temperature, we're more likely to see some of those fusels esterify and become more flavor compounds. That's the core concept behind this. Now, we saw this chart a few times today, and this is what I want to use to kind of highlight this free rise technique. So if you notice in the fermentation, VDKs or diacetyl really peaks around the 60-hour point. The fermentation is really done around the 100 to 120-hour point. So for here, if you were performing a free rise, and say we're fermenting this beer at, say, 18 degrees Celsius, say this was like a clean ale or a blonde ale, we're going to see all these things below the 60-hour point be decreased. We're going to see less VDKs. We're going to see diacetyl. We're going to see less higher alcohols. We're going to see less esters. They're all going to be pitched down. But then when we increase temperature at the end, we're going to see this peak. So there's this spike down of diacetyl. It's become much more steep. The rate at which diacetyl we reuptake is going to plummet very quickly. We're also going to see an increased rate of specific gravity decrease because the yeast cells are fermenting. They're hotter. They're going to ferment faster. So we're going to see them reach FG faster. Where before it may have taken 100 to 120 hours, this will probably take 90 to 100 hours. So we'll see an increase in the rate of fermentation. We're also, because you can see here, that at 60-hour point, we're still increasing our ester profile quite significantly. We will likely see this spike up. We'll see the rate of the amount of esters being produced get increase quite significantly. But as you can see here with fusels, they're probably going to stay pretty stable. Now, some breweries will do this 3/4 of the way through. Some will do it halfway through. Some will do it even earlier, but I'd caution you against doing so. This can be a really good technique when you're trying to make kind of clean beers quickly, or IPAs, where you're not trying to get very expressive yeast cells. If you're trying to get expressiveness in the yeast cell, this is probably not the best way to do it, but it is a way to push more product through your facility. If you're trying to make light, crispy lagers or just kind of elbow benders where you're not worried about sulfur profile or delicate fermentation characteristics, this is phenomenal. This allows you to get beer through your facility much faster, much more quickly. However, the increase in temperature, as we alluded to earlier, is going to flash off a lot of that dissolved sulfur and a lot of that dissolved CO2, releasing a lot of flavor compounds that would be lacking in a higher quality. You'd say that if they're not present, would be a deficit to, say, a higher quality lager. If it's your Coors Light clone or something like that, where you just want a large volume of it, this is a great technique. Yeah, and with that, oh, yeah, that's right. And that's just kind of the summary for it. So we're going to see a decrease in fuses and diacetyl by a colder fermentation start, an increase in diacetyl and acetaldehyde reuptake at the end because of the higher fermentation temp, increase in esters to the higher fermentation temp halfway through ferment, and less time to reach FG, which is incredibly useful for certain styles. And with that, we're done for today. I hope you guys enjoyed all this, got a lot of information out of it, and I think we're good time for open for some questions. Once Richard fixes his mic. Less technical difficulties than last week. I will say that. There are less technical difficulties than last week. We'll give him a second or two. There he goes.
Can you hear me now?
All is well, good sir.
Excellent. Thanks, Nate. I think that was very informative. Once again, I think I like the philosophy of trying to get inside the head of the yeast and think like a yeast and try to get better and more predictable results brewing that way. We do have some time for some questions. Before we launch into those questions, I just wanted to mention that we will be hosting our Q&A this Thursday, April 2nd at 8:30, and we'll be answering any remaining questions from the Yeast Basics webinar and also diving into some of the questions that we thought were really interesting or that we needed to do a little bit more reading to be able to answer properly. I also just wanted to mention that we've launched the next batch of our webinars on the Crowdcast page. So we're going to be talking about beer yeast flavor diversity on April 6th. So diving into this massive experiment that we did to compare, basically did a 65 strain split batch experiment. Crazy stuff, a lot of useful information in there. On April 9th, we're going to be talking about biotransformation. So, what happens when yeast and hops get together? The answer is magic, and we're going to try to explain and break down exactly what biotransformation is. And then we're also going to be sharing a webinar with a special guest, Isabel Netto, on the road to Lactobacillus 2.0 on April 14th. Really exciting one there. We're going to talk about a lot of the work that we've done in the past on demonstrating that Lactobacillus strains are very, very different from each other, have very, very different flavors. So try to get us away from the concept of the boring kettle sour into a more enlightened world. So without further ado, I think we do have a good amount of time to answer some questions. Our first question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there's one question I just want to point out here that I think I don't know if we're going to get into. I think it's Jeffrey Drake mentioned. It's in the chat, not in the questions. That can you do secondary aeration to augment oxidation without too much damage? So essentially, can you aerate into fermentation? Some breweries do aerate into fermentation. However, it's kind of controversial in a sense, and it's not well understood. It's by no means standard, but some breweries do it with a large degree of success. One of the talks I would love to do during this series is actually with a brewer that does that, and I'm rather fascinated by it, and I want to learn more about it.
I think I know who that brewer is, and
you absolutely know who that brewer is.
A pretty great talk on open fermentation, and I would love to present that for sure.
Exactly.
Okay, so without further ado, the first, by far the most popular question that we have on here is, do you have information about the speed of cold? They say cold crushing. Sometimes it's nice to crush some cold ones. Cold crashing. Especially in lagers, they usually say you should do it very slow, 1 Celsius per day or less. What are your thoughts on that, and does that matter?
I have heard many people say that, and I've had their beers, and they're delicious. So I'm not hesitant to take that advice. When it comes to cell stress, there's an argument that would actually work quite well. So whenever you stress yeast cells out, especially with cold, they will produce what's called cold shock proteins. Especially when it's quite drastic. And yeast cells, when you chill them, they actually have to change the composition of their cell membranes. So it's not just, we're cold crashing now. They actually have to produce proteins and structures that allow them to handle this scenario. So by slowly crashing it, you're kind of like adding if you're lifting weights, so like adding 5 pounds on, 5 pounds on, 5 pounds on, opposed to, hey, go lift all that weight now and then hold it. It's a staggered approach to it, which is easily argumented to be an easier thing for them to acclimate to. Mm-hmm. It's you're more likely to hurt yourself if the first time you go to the gym try to bench press like 200 pounds. It's not going to go well. Mm-hmm. You work up to it. That's kind of one of the theories behind that. There's some breweries that also say you need to have, I've heard some people say 1 degree C, like per 12 hours as a maximum, but who knows? And if you go to really old school facilities, this is before we had like glycol cooling and things like that. Instead of cold crashing the beer by turning on glycol jackets, they transfer it from a cooled open fermenter into a sealed tank in a cold room. So because it's a cold room, it's going to slowly cool the beer down. It's not going to suddenly cool. It's going to be slowly ambiently cooled. And that always seems to be a very gentle, kind of consistent way to knock the temperature down. I would recommend it. I don't think there's a lot of easily accessible data in North America for it, but anecdotally, all the beers I've had for breweries that do that are amazing.
Yeah, it's sort of one of those things is, is this voodoo magic or is there something to it? And it's kind of hard to separate. It does seem to be more consistent with people who are using more traditional techniques. You showed a fermenter from De La Seine, and that's, one example of a brewery in Belgium that's fermenting pretty hot, pretty fast, and then transferring to these tanks inside a cold room. And it, effectively just because of thermal mass, they're cold crashing very slowly. Yep. Maybe there's some merit to that. I'm not sure if anyone's done any actual experimentation there.
Probably not, but institutional knowledge opposed to research, probably.
Absolutely. The next question, and I think that's the one that we'll definitely be getting into next week in detail, is what are some yeast characteristics that promote hop biotransformation? I think that's part of why we kind of left this out of this this particular webinar.
And there's just too much content.
Absolutely, yeah. So just to give you a little bit of a teaser for next week, biotransformation, when we talk about it a lot, right? Especially people that are making hoppy beers, hazy beers. We talk about it a lot. Not everyone knows exactly what it means. It actually means 4 or 5 different things. So we're going to sort of break that down into all of the different reactions that are happening between our yeast and our hops that we call biotransformation, and get a better perspective on that.
Yeah, it's not exactly what you think it is. It's until recently it wasn't what we thought it was either.
No,
like a few years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another lager question, Nate. We're getting a lot of these.
Of course.
We are highly focused on brewing lagers. How could we get more sulfur from the yeast for some of our more traditional beers?
Spunding is probably the best way to do that. That'd be the first thing I would go towards. If spunding isn't giving you the results that you're looking for, I'd be very shocked. The next thing I would then start looking at is my barley varietals. So, like where I'm actually sourcing my Pilsner malt from. Different maltsters are going to, just by the nature of the product they're working with, going to emphasize certain amino acids over other ones, which can lead to more or less sulfur production. You could also try and alter your aeration levels to try and increase or decrease cell growth, which will alter the amount of sulfur compounds that are being produced. If you have a tall fermenter, fermenting that. You could try fermenting the beer a degree or two colder, but that has time issues, so it's not always possible. And then I would think it just comes down to nutrients. Like we've had some clients who have had big sulfur problems in their beers, and it's the malt that's actually causing it. It's the lack of nutrition that's being provided to the yeast cells that's causing the yeast cells in this case to produce unwanted sulfur. So if you want more sulfur, I'd probably spund and then look at your malt supplier. That would be my first 2 steps.
Yep. The only thing I would add there is that yeast strain selection matters a lot with sulfur production.
Yes, of course.
As well. Just even speaking from, like, if you're using like dry 3470, that strain's selected because it's super, super clean and neutral. There are more expressive lager strains out there. If you look at with our catalog, if you look at Czech Lager or Beer Garden, those are both higher sulfur strains. Yeah, if you're looking for that kind of really characteristic sulfury lager character, like those are the ones to go with, and you're never going to get that, kind of thing from a 3470 necessarily. And then even from our collection, like some of them are very, very neutral, like the Mexi lager, Isar lager are very low sulfur, so I would never use those in those. For example, like German pills, where I personally want a little bit of that in there.
Yep. It kind of helps convey that yes, this is a lager, not just an ale, and it makes it nice and bright.
It can
crispy.
make it feel a little bit fresher and more crispy. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
I don't know how to quantify crispy, but yeah.
We need a KBU.
Yeah.
IKU.
Yeah, this is an interesting next question. So it starts off with, I've got a cat. So I'm wondering if it is possible to simulate open fermentation without actually having an open fermenter. I guess they're worried about the cat getting into the beer. Could air be changed in the fermenter through an air filter and have the same effect?
As I've been talking, my cat has been harassing my feet. I too know the feeling. Maybe that's kind of a tough one. So
I can, just speaking from my own experience, because I did a couple experiments with open fermentation with Kvike, and this was at our facility in the summer. So what I did, and this was just like one of those SS like little 20-liter conical things. I put a brew bag just over top of it and secured that. So I kind of just had this barrier, but it was still very much open fermenting.
Yeah, but a cat's going to jump on that and then fall in. That's where I'm going.
Right. It's not
going to work. You could try fermenting in a carboy, and because the carboy is rounded on the top, it's something that the cat couldn't jump on, and then use cheesecloth on top of that.
Yeah, that's something I've done.
And then use elastic bands.
Yeah,
that is probably how I would approach that.
Okay.
Yeah, being familiar with the threats that cats pose. Yes.
That's an awesome question. I didn't see that coming. Today and last time you talked about open fermentation in a craft brewery with tanks between 40 and 80 hectoliters is just not having a blow-off hooked up enough to have an open fermentation, or should a craft brewery look at buying an open fermenter to make these beer styles?
That comes almost down to a like an ethos, like a driving motive force in a sense. You see some breweries that will get traditional equipment to make these styles, and other breweries try to modify their equipment as much as possible. You could try, just not having a blow-off bucket, because the blow-off bucket is going to give you some back pressure. Absolutely. I know of one facility that will, when they're trying to make beers like this, they leave the manway on the top of the tank slightly ajar. That way, you're going to get some more gas transfer inside of it. You then have to, when you're then finished with the beer, you have to go up and close it. So there's that thing you need from a health and safety standpoint. You have to factor in. And one of the biggest things you can do, like I'm always a fan of solutions that are kind of a spectrum. Like, we try this, if this doesn't work, we go to the next. They go to the next, go to the next. So the first thing I would try to do is start blasting those things with a lot more oxygen than you think. I would argue that with almost all our clients who have problems with this, or even just breweries in general, I don't think everyone's aerating as heavily as they think they are. A lot of breweries are under aerating because they're just, that we see 15 liters per minute on the stone, and that's how it goes. But that's, there's more variables there. If you haven't cleaned your CO2 stone in a while, the bubbles going into solution are this big, and you want them tiny, and you want a lot of them, which means that your surface area to volume ratio is completely out of whack. The small bubbles have a much higher pressure than the big bubbles, which means they're going to have a much more motive force for those bubbles to dissolve inside of CO2. I would first look at increasing your aeration rate, in which I would probably first look at making sure my CO2 stone my O2 stone is properly cleaned. Like soak the thing in caustic for 2 days and then try to use it. Then I would try to keep your tank ajar and see how you like it. And then, maybe if you're still not happy with it, then go to the next one. Then try, maybe an open ferment, or maybe the manway door completely open, or some sort of modification of that. Stainless is expensive. Try not to buy stainless when possible.
Yep. Yeah, I'll add that. Yeah, one thing I've seen people experiment with, if they want to experiment with open fermentation, is IBC totes. You know, very affordable. Yes. You can get them for a couple $100, and at least the first few times you can get it pretty clean. And so that is really an option for just, you know, tinkering with open ferments and deciding if it's worth the investment. Or
milk tanks. Milk tanks are a dime a dozen. They're pretty cheap to get.
Yep. Yeah. The issue with I guess the issue with either of these is holding a seal. Not easy.
Well, if it's an open ferment, you don't really have to. You open ferment, then transfer into another vessel.
Yeah.
You know, brewhouse logistics is always a problem. That's a whole other thing.
Absolutely. Our next question is about Hefeweizen. For Hefeweizen, sometimes it's advised to underpitch to stress the yeast and get more esters. Do you have an opinion about this?
I hate solutions that sacrifice the yeast, and I'm not. I know I'm objectively biased on this because yeast is what we do, but that I don't know. I have found a lot of old school knowledge that suggests that things like this are okay, and my biggest complaint with solutions that say hurt the yeast is that your success rate just dives. So you don't know if you're hurting the yeast or killing the yeast. And if you kill the yeast, you get bad flavors. If you're hurting the yeast, you can get good flavors that one time. So unless you have a really good handle on that portion of your micro, I probably wouldn't recommend doing it, just because you don't like your success rate is going to be lower than what it probably should be. I would probably looking at other recommendations, probably a lower pitch rate, higher oxygenation rate than other ones. And one thing we didn't talk about, which is important, is that the open fermentation tends to, or just higher oxygen levels, tends to produce healthier yeast cells. Simply because they have all the things they need. They're able to go through a little bit of aerobic respiration, which means that they're not having to, they're regenerating some of their NADH stores. They're giving themselves more of these little micronutrients that are required for proper fermentation. For proper cell health, and they're not stuck in fermentation the entire time. An open ferment really does have some benefits from that, or just giving the yeast cells proper levels of O2. Like it's really hard to over aerate a culture. Now, it's possible, and we've had a client that did it, and I was kind of impressed, but they did it. It was a weird kind of convergence of internal improvements that hadn't been corrected. It was interesting.
For sure. Yeah, that's a little bit more rare. This is a two-parter, actually, because there's an interesting question. There's also an interesting follow-up question. So I've actually got an answer to the follow-up question, but I'm going to let you tackle the first one. The question is it true that SO5 produces a lot of sulfur compounds, and why? And maybe we can extend that question to just American ale yeasts in general.
Yes, but they usually flash off. Like almost all yeast strains, I think I mentioned this last time, but they almost all yeast strains, I think actually I can't think of any that wouldn't produce sulfur. It's just when you ferment at higher temperatures, all that sulfur flashes off because it's not as soluble in CO2. Sorry, in liquid as CO2. It's only when you start spunding or capping or capturing that CO2 that you start seeing the sulfur remain inside the fermentation, or you start fermenting like 12 degrees Celsius. Now, as we frustratingly know, Cali will ferment at 12 degrees Celsius.
Oh, yeah.
Like Cali in many cases will go down to like 2 degrees Celsius, which is, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm sorry. But it's scary.
30 something. Yeah.
Yeah. It's from a homebrew packaging standpoint, it's infuriating because they get bloaty like right away. It's just one of these strains that you just have problems with. About 36. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah.
And the follow-up question, which is, getting on this topic of American ale yeasts cold. The follow-up question was, I want to know why SO5 supposedly expresses peach when cold. And I think part of the answer to that is that for whatever reason, the American ale strains are fairly metabolically active cold. And more recently, we haven't got anywhere close to publishing this yet, but we do have some data showing that our Cali strain is most aromatically active around 15 Celsius, so 60 Fahrenheit or so, which is kind of surprising because usually with most yeasts, you go hotter, you get more esters. That yeast seems to break the rules. And one of the key esters that is produced at that low temperature is ethyl caproate, which to most people it's more like pineapple-y, but I could see that being perceived as peach as well. It's just kind of a bright fruitiness.
Yep. Yeah, I mentioned at the top that for esters they get a little complex, and 90%. These applies to 90% of the strains. There's one of the 10%.
Oh yeah, and like every day we're still learning more about these things, and maybe some of the rules about flavor production will be broken in the future. We're not really sure yet as we dive into more diverse strains.
There are some rules that when I was first learning about all fermentation that are now defunct, especially look at Brettanomyces and things like that. Jesus.
Yeah. Kind of overhauled how we, what we know about bread.
Completely.
Yeah. I think we got time for a few more questions.
Yep.
So here's another good one. From a home brewing perspective, underpitching is very easily identifiable. What would be the overpitching threshold for a typical house strain? For example, Cali, English, etc. So like what would happen if you overpitched those?
Okay, so Cali is really hard to kind of get a feel for overpitching, especially in process. Now, if you're using dry every single time, or you're using fresh or using liquid, it's going to be harder to observe an underpitch. Just if you're not reusing these cells, an overpitch if you're not reusing these cells every single time. Because the symptoms of an overpitch typically are cleaner ferments for the first two, maybe one to three times, and then it all starts going downhill. So the first time you use it, it'll just be super clean. The second time you use it, it might, it's going to still be really clean, but it's going to have a little bit, probably a little, of acetaldehyde, maybe a little diacetyl. Acetaldehyde is usually the thing that starts rearing its head first. And then once you get to the third ferment, that's when you start seeing things really go downhill, where you start seeing under attenuation, where the beer should have finished at 2 degrees Plato and it's at 4. And it's sweet and perceptible afterwards. And you have acetaldehydes increase. You might have some diacetyl start coming up, and it's just, it kind of becomes a different mess than underpitching, where underpitching is often diacetyl and fusel and weird esters, and different esters, especially with English strains. Like I often get with English when you underpitch or just kind of neglect in any sort of way. Like Bazooka Joe bubblegum is how I usually describe it. Like that kind of weird, spicy, sweet, just kind of amalgam of other flavors that I can't put my finger on what it is. I often get that in not a pleasant way. That's often how I see it kind of materialize with English ales, especially some of the more expressive ones. But with the Cali, it's just clean, and then all of a sudden, under attenuated hot garbage. But you require a few generations in order for that to really come in. And like if you're doing starters between each one, then you're giving them tons of oxygen where they can kind of recoup against that. If you're not doing that, then you're going to have problems. It's not one of the things that we had to cut from today was other stressors that can occur inside the brew house, and that's one of them, especially when it comes to cropping and storage, and that's a whole other topic on its own, which that would probably answer a bit more accurately when we get to that. That'll clear that up.
Yep, and I think we're going to try to get into yeast management in the future. The only thing I wanted to add there is the one strain where it seems like overpitching is a regular issue is the common Kolsch strain. So, our Kolsch Ale, WLP029, that kind of standard Kolsch strain. When that one's repeatedly overpitched, that seems to fairly consistently result in acetaldehyde off flavors. And sometimes it's important to stress that some yeasts need that sort of dialed in pitch rate more than others. Okay, here's a good question. We got time for a couple more, I think.
Yeah.
Kveik fermentation. If you pitch hot, do you keep that temperature throughout the entire fermentation?
It's Kveik, sure.
Yeah. Fair enough. I've been an advocate for I have seen some instances of people who have gotten off flavors from holding that ferment hot, especially past the point where it's done. Like if it's at FG and it's still being held over 30 Celsius, 90 Fahrenheit, then you're really damaging the cells at that point. They don't want to be sitting hot for too long. They want to rip through the wort and get the hell out of there. And so sometimes if you have a Kvike beer that has like almost like a cheesy or like a dairy or like rubbery off flavor, that's usually a result of the yeast actually being stressed or dying and imparting that flavor to the beer. So with Kvike beers, especially with home brews, I usually suggest like pitch at your target pitch temperature. For most of those, traditionally, it's somewhere between 30 and 40 Celsius. And then do your best to insulate that fermentation so that it can keep itself reasonably warm, but you don't want to like keep holding it super hot unless you're able to monitor it like every single day and then just turn that cooling off when the ferment's done, because otherwise you may risk some of those rubbery off flavors. And that was something that was flagged as being a somewhat regular off flavor with Kvike beers that people were experiencing. And that's one way to avoid it.
Cool. Yeah, I got nothing else to add on that.
Cool.
There's a few other really good questions in here. I'm excited for this.
And actually, this is very much on the same topic. So those flavors I was talking about, rubbery, etc., that's autolysis. That's the yeast dying and spilling its guts into the beer. And you typically don't want to taste those guts. So the question is, in beer fermentation, you usually have to remove the yeast at some point to avoid autolysis off flavors. But I've heard that in mead fermentation, sometimes they want to keep the mead on the leaves for interesting flavors.
So Richard, you're almost uniquely positioned to
answer that question.
You are. You're kind of the one that did a lot of the research on it.
Yeah. So I did my master's thesis on yeast autolysis in sparkling wine. So I can explain this maybe. So the key difference here is really how much that process is controlled. So if you're in beer and you've got beer yeast, you typically have like a pretty high amount of biomass, just a high amount of yeast that's sitting in the bottom of that ferment. And so as that yeast starts to die, it will create some of these autolytic byproducts that are released from the yeast. Those will react, especially with oxygen. Those will react to create unpleasant flavors. Typically, the unique features of wine and mead is that they typically do have a higher alcohol content, higher tannin content. They can sort of resist some of those things a little bit better. And so in those systems, in wine or mead, autolysis can actually be a positive thing. It also comes down to like how much yeast is in that vessel. Like with wine or with mead, you might leave it on leaves, but you're probably not leaving it on as much yeast as you would, a beer that's just finished primary fermenting. It's usually a smaller volume. Like if you look at traditional sparkling wine where they're aging it on the leaves in a bottle, it's a little bit of yeast in the bottom of the bottle. It's not a huge amount. And when there's a little bit of yeast and it's temperature controlled, it's a very, very controlled process. You can get these beneficial secondary, toasty, complex flavors out of the dead yeast. But if that's not controlled or there's too much yeast, then you can get these like horrible rubbery off flavors. So it really comes down to like how much yeast is there, and then also like what is actually the liquid that yeast is being extracted into. I will say in the case of beer, there are some examples where autolysis is good, right? If you've got a mixed fermentation beer, as your primary yeast dies, it's going to release things that are useful to the Brettanomyces and the bacteria to sort of keep those flavor reactions moving. So it's not always bad.
Yep.
Cool.
Got a few more?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We got a lot of Hefeweizen questions, which is like kind of interesting to me.
We're entering summer.
Loving that, yeah. How do I up the volatiles in a Hefeweizen? I want banana, I want phenol, I want it all.
And I want it now. So one of the biggest things I find with Hefe is it's strain dependent. I notice a huge variety of variation amongst them. So my favorite strain that we have is Überweizen by far. And I always got frustrated with Hefeweizen when it came to ester production because I never really pushed enough of it out. I tried using other ones that they kind of are Weizen 1, which is somewhat analogous to WP300. I always got a lot of clove from it, but I couldn't drive the ester out of it, and it always frustrated me. I get it on the rare occasion. How I would approach this is a few fold. First off, I do an open ferment, and this might sound like me I'm actually not the big of an I like open ferments, but I feel like in this talk I've been like an advocate for it. I'm very odd about it. That's going to help drive more aeration. Sorry, more esters. So what you might want to do also is potentially add more oxygen in mid fermentation. If you can't open ferment, that might be a benefit to it. But what I would really want to do here is halfway through ferment, I would want to transfer this into a CCV or seal it right up. I would want to try and capture as much of those things as possible. And this beer style really needs to be served fresh. That's one of the best ways to help preserve those esters, because esters will just thermally break down with time. So they will just fall apart. There's no way around it. One of the other big things I would do for this, and this is one of the things that we had, one of our employees who actually did this when he was a student of mine, he looked at Hefeweizens and he started adding dextrose to it, simple sugars. And one of the things that we know is that this higher the simple sugar concentration is, the more, I believe it's ethyl esters we see come out of the fermentation. So that's going to be a way to help drive more of those flavor compounds. So if you want to, say, increase your esters, one of the things you might start looking at is adding simple sugars to your grain bill. Now, if you look at some old school Hefeweizen brewery methodology, there is actually a way they do this. There's an enzyme called maltase that's activated around, I think, 35 or 34 degrees Celsius. It's really low. And what these brewers would do is that they would take kind of the second runnings of their previous batch and use it for the strike water of their next batch. But they do a mash in at 35 or so to help do, I think it's phytase rest, if I'm correct. But what that would do is it would take the maltose that was left over in the last beer, which maltose is disaccharide we talked about last week, and break it down to glucose. So you're essentially generating glucose without having to add table sugar or just dextrose powder to it, which is a way to kind of naturally do this in process. But it requires you brewing 24/7, 7 days a week, or 52 weeks a year. It's not practical. I also like the Überweisen because it's a much higher ester-focused strain than a lot of the other ones. It is high ester all the time, and you can dial in your phenols with kind of malt profile or ferulic acid rests as you see fit. I'm a big fan of that one.
Yep. Yeah, and the other thing I would add in terms of the phenols is you have to know, the precursors are coming from the malt. So the variety of malt might have different amounts of precursors, and then also the actual grain variety might impact it. Something that's interesting is like malt typically has more of the ferulic acid. So if you can push up the wheat malt concentration, you can sometimes get a little bit more of that, but it also is, malt and variety specific as well.
From also just from a malt standpoint, a lot of Hefeweizen, like traditional Hefeweizen recipes, recommend that you use like some Munich malt in there. I would really recommend that when you're starting off, just use, Pilsner malt and white wheat malt, and then layer in your sweetness afterwards. Like Hefeweizen really is a beer where you have to dial in each variable and then move on to the next. It really isn't like a single one-off beer. It's something you have to dial in over and over.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna end at this last question. And this is something we didn't necessarily talk about, but I think it's an interesting one to briefly cover. I've noticed that dry hopping during fermentation increases the diacetyl production and also lengthens the time for the yeast to clean up the diacetyl. Is there anything we can do to reduce the diacetyl in this process?
Absolutely. And I'm going to start off by saying, hi, Jason. There's also one other question I want to answer quickly on after we finish this, just because I like it. So dry hop induced diacetyl is a whole. There's a lot of people doing research on this thing, and there seems to be kind of a few different thought processes going on. So, what my conceptualization of it right now is that we're adding. Okay, I need to back this a little bit. Hops actually have some alpha amylase to them. They actually have some amylase capacity to them. So they're going to be able to break down some of the dextrins that are currently in fermentation into simple sugars, which the yeast cells are going to want to consume. Now, yeast cells they don't like hops in particular. They struggle with IBUs, that they can work with it. But when you're fermenting in the active presence as hops, those hops stick to the outside of the yeast cells. They make them gummy. They make it harder to function, and it stresses them out. So what the prediction here is that when you have these yeast cells fermenting in a stressful environment, as they're near the end of dormancy, they're currently consuming large amounts of maltotriose. Now you're giving them a new sugar profile to consume that they haven't seen in a while. You're putting them in a very twisted, confusing, complicated space. One of the first things that yeast cells do to try and react to things like this is produce proteins to, or more yeast cells to buffer themselves out, which require valine. Therefore, they're going to produce diacetyl and they're going to secrete it because they're not super healthy and fit at this point. I've heard of more breweries having problems with this. So the breweries have had more problems when they've dry hopped later into fermentation than they have when they dry hopped earlier into fermentation. Because when they're early into fermentation, they can keep on going, and then they can kind of rip through it a bit faster. They're not on the decline yet. They're kind of still in that exponential growth phase. What I would also recommend for this is kind of a secondary solution for it. Often the time what you see some breweries do, especially with New England IPAs and things like that, is they'll say they have the beer 2/3 of the way through fermentation, and they're going to do that free rise bit. They will transfer the entire beer into a new fermenter vessel with the hops already in there, so that as they're filling this new tank, the hops are mixing, agitating properly, getting saturated, all that good stuff. This is a huge amount of benefits. The first one is that your yeast cake is now preserved in your initial tank, which means that you have easy access to yeast for you to go. You don't want to harvest yeast that is stressed out in the presence of hops. This is one of the things that we're going to talk about today, but this is a whole other topic. The other thing is, I'm sure we've all seen videos of this, is people on ladders trying to add hops to a fermenter, and hops, beer is spraying everywhere. The worst cases I've heard of this was someone on a skyjack dumping a garbage pail full of hops, and then they're trying to slam the lid on, but they couldn't get the lid on properly because it's a beer geyser coming towards them, and they're on the top of the skyjack with all this foam coming towards them, and beer foam contains CO2, and they're like partially asphyxiating and can't breathe, and they're covered in beer and on a skyjack. You don't do that. You don't have to do that if you do this method. It's wonderful. It's safe. Absolutely much safer. And you, by doing this, you're also potentially adding a little bit of oxygen in that transfer line, because whenever you do transfer beer, you're going to always add a little bit of oxygen. So a little bit of oxygen can help uptick, or overcome the diacetyl that's being produced. So it's there's some ways around it.
Cool.
The last question I wanted to answer,
go for it.
Yeah, it's really really quick. Let me just go through here and find it. Would you what are your recommendations you made regarding Trappist yeast strains? Also include the Ardennes strain. It absolutely would. The Ardennes strain is one of my favorite Trappist yeast strains out there, just because it's really consistent. It's wonderful. I tried using it with a wit, and I actually really liked it as well. So it seems to be really kind of a powerhouse for it. It's not my favorite Trappist strain. My favorite Trappist strains are still Dry Belgian, which is diastatic though. So it's, beware. And my second favorite one is St. Lucifer, which from a home standpoint, it's phenomenal. But from a commercial standpoint, don't you dare use it. Because it's the Duvel strain, which is, I'm sure we've all had Duvel before. But it is horrific to work with. Like it is one of the most finicky, just frustrating yeast cells to work with. Don't recommend anyone use it. I recommend the Dry Belgian strain over that one. Even though I like that one more, it is commercial suicide to try to use that as a house strain.
Yeah, God. Strain is the worst.
Like it's the best and it's the worst.
Yeah. No, Ardennes is awesome. Totally bomb-proof. In terms of controlling flavor, like you can get some of those nice fruity aromas even from colder ferments. In terms of like the fermentation temperature, I would say it's probably more towards like the banana, grape kind of thing at colder temperatures, and probably more towards like the tropical fruit, orchard fruit kind of thing at the hotter temperatures in general.
Yep. Yeah, can also do some weird pineapple things at low temps. I had that once.
Okay. Yeah, it's
cool. Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah,
for sure. Okay, so we're at just over an hour and a half, so I think we'll
good
off. We've been compiling all of the questions from all three of the Yeast Basics seminars, and we're going to sort of put those all into categories, and we're going to have a little presentation and also just keep the Q&A rolling on Thursday. Really excited to answer some of the questions that that we honestly were a little stumped by, and try to provide more knowledge here. And just based on the questions that we're hearing,
I think we'll try to focus some content on lagers, on Hefeweizens, open fermentation. It seems like these are not the topics I expected to be popular, but I'm glad that they are.
There's going to be a lot on yeast management too. Like we've seen a few things in the comments about that, and I want to give that talk. We're
sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on Thursday.
Cheers, everyone. Have a good night.